Hello, this is Senior Mitchell diving into the world of science and how seeds become plants. Here are your questions. How do seeds become plants? Well, you probably know some of it anyway, that you plant a seed and it later becomes a plant, but here's a little bit more about it. Inside each seed is a partially developed plant. And of course, under favorable conditions, this plant will form and will grow. The seed has kind of three parts to the inside of it and a part on the outside of it. The first part is going to be called the embryo. And you can see that we have an embryo here. The embryo is the baby plant, or as the book will put it, any root, stem, or leaves that are embedded in the seed. Now, the entire seed here is not the embryo. There's going to be food storage there. And I'll explain that because that kind of sounds strange with something that's an autotroph that can make its own food, why you would have a need for food storage. But we'll get to that. So one important part of a seed is an embryo, which is the root, stem, leaf embedded in the seed. Now, the next part happens to not be on the bottom part here, but I have it here. See if I can remind myself how to pronounce that. Cotyledon. Cotyledons are the leaves inside the seed. So that means the cotyledons are in fact part of the embryo. Now, in doing some research, I've had some pictures like this where they've also pointed the cotyledons as being the inside of the seed itself, but I believe you'll need to know that it is the leaf part which will eventually sprout out. Finally, you probably noticed this one, the food storage. And that takes up a majority of the seed. Now, the food can be stored inside this embryo area, even in the cotyledon, but in many cases it is just the rest of the seed. The outer covering of the seed is called the seed coat. And I know I haven't gotten to why we have food here yet, but let me go over all these parts. The outer covering is the seed coat, and of course it acts not only as a layer of protection, but it mostly keeps the seed from drying out. Now, you could let seeds lie around for years and years, then plant them, and you could still get a plant out of them. So the reason you could do that is because of the seed coat. It has that protection that keeps the seed from drying out. If it had dried out, that would eliminate the food storage here, which means it would be very hard for it to actually germinate. So what's going to happen, they end up, these are the parts of the seed here. The seed ends up in a particularly good area, and it grows. Now, getting to that particularly good area is kind of what you might call seed dispersal. And you probably can figure out how you can get these seeds dispersed. You could have an animal like this strange looking animal here, who either has the seed attached to it, like a cocklebur is a seed that attaches to animals, or the animal eats it and it comes out in their poop. Either way, they move the seed away from where it started. Another way you can move the seed, of course, is wind. Doesn't even have to be as bad as this wind. And a little bit of water, which this is not a little bit, but wind, water, and animals are the primary way you get seeds away from the mother and father plant, I guess you might say. Water and wind can disperse them. Also, some plants actually eject their seeds, propelling them out like a popcorn. Now, that came from our textbook, and I tried to look it up, and I can't really see what seed and plant that is. But anyway, let's talk about germination. That is, whenever it does get to be a seedling, when it does start being more young plant than it does seed itself. After the seed finds the right condition, it absorbs water from the environment, and then it uses that stored food to grow. So going back here, it has all this food here, and that food is used in its initial growing before it is able to have photosynthesis. So that's why you have the food there, and it's called a seedling in this process here, where you have them just, the roots have started growing down and the stems have started growing up. And it's called a seedling at this point. Now a seedling has to compete. I know they're not animals, but they still have to compete for light, for nutrients, and for water. Even if it's the parent of the plant is close by, it has to compete with them. So if there are trees all over the top of this seedling, it's not going to get as much light. If the mother tree is right next to it here, then the mother tree will end up getting a lot of the water, and it might not get a lot of the water. So in many cases, it's good for these seedlings not to really be close to its original parent, you might say. Well, the roots are going to end up getting nutrients and water, and the roots can also store food. Now, speaking of roots, let's have a different page on them. There are two different types of roots. There is the fibrous roots, which are all similar sized, and you can see right here that we have a bunch of fibrous roots here, and notice they're pretty much the same type of root all the way down, and they look like fibers. I mean, there's a bunch of them, and they can get to be a tangled mess. If you were to pull this out, you would get all the dirt that is stuck up in here amongst the fibers, and it would yank out too. Kind of like an onion. An onion has fibrous roots. Lawn grass, corn, they all have fibrous roots also. Now the other type that we have here, other type of root is called a taproot. You can see here you have one main root that stems from it, and all the other roots are little roots that come from it. And you can have incredibly small little fibers that even help in getting of the water and sending it back to the main root, which ends up taking it up into the plant itself. So either way it functions. Carrots, dandelions, a cactus is like that, and from what I understand, they're very hard to pull up from the ground. I haven't pulled any cacti up from the ground lately, so I don't remember. But roots contain many things. They have a root cap, which is going to be pretty much the outer layer of the root, kind of a layer of protection. But inside that root cap is where you get the phloem. You may remember that term from a previous video, where you get the phloem, which is going to take any food up to the plant, and you get the xylem, which is going to take any minerals or water up into the plant. And these are cells, the phloem cells and the xylem cells, that are going to take, they're kind of like the highway, they're kind of like the expressway that takes it up into the plant. So you're going to have that in there. You're going to have those little bitty root hairs that come out the roots. Now don't forget these phloem and xylems are vascular tissues, which means they have the long tube-like tissues which take them up in there. So now let's talk about the stems. You can see we're going kind of straight up the plant here. Let's talk about the stem of the plant. The stem is also a highway that takes the nutrients and the water up to the leaves. And they have pretty much the same thing that the roots have, as far as they have the phloem, they have the xylem, and they have kind of an outer covering on them. Now these stems do a couple of different things. They are not only that highway to get the water up through there, they get the plant closer to the sun's warmth and give it some stability, you might say. Now some of these stems are herbaceous. Herbaceous pretty much means it's not wood. You know, woody plants like trees are much more stable. Something like a dandelion, something like a flower would have a a less wood-like stem, kind of just a plant-like stem, you might say. So that's kind of the couple of different stems you might get. Now, one thing kind of interesting about the rings of a tree. Now, the rings of a tree are part of the stem of a woody plant. These rings right here are actually the xylem. You may remember the xylem are the long roots that go, not necessarily roots, but they're the long cells that go up in a plant and take the water and the nutrients. And that's what these cells are. And the ones you can tell, well, you probably already know this, but whenever you have a thicker line, kind of like you do here, that meant you had a lot of those cells. It was a rainy season. But when you have a thin line, kind of like right here, well, not quite as thick as this one, then it was kind of a drought year. So that's one way scientists can look back and count back and see what years were drought years in a particular area and what years were more rainy years in those particular areas. You know, since we've talked about the roots and the stems, why don't we go to leaves? Now, we talked a little bit about some of the items with the leaves. With the leaves, first of all, it captures the sun's energy. This is where you get all the photosynthesis. You got the sun's energy. It's where you have all the photosynthesis. It's where all the food making's going on. In the leaves. And we have already talked about this top layer and bottom layer called the cuticle. The cuticle kind of is a layer of protection, kind of keeps the water in. And you'll find out in a little bit that it's a good thing they had that because a lot of water actually goes out. You still have the phloem and xylem cells that run through here, and that's going to be these cells right through here in the middle. You still have the phloem and the xylem cells, but do you notice at the bottom part it's a lot more spacious, and the reason is because of the stomata here. The stomata lets in the oxygen and exhales the carbon dioxide, and since it's right here near the bottom of the leaf, that's where you're going to end up finding a little more space in which to get that oxygen up in there and get that carbon dioxide up in there, I should say, and get the oxygen released out. I think I said it opposite earlier. Well, anyway, all these cells up here are filled with chloroplasts, which, as you know, is a big help toward photosynthesis. You couldn't have it without it. The upper leaf cells are dense, but the widely spaced cells are indeed in the lower leaf. There's one more thing we need to talk about, and that is transpiration. You may remember in the 6th grade that you can actually have evaporation of water coming out of leaves. And I draw it from the top. It's not from the top. It's from the stomata. You actually have evaporation go straight from the leaves into the air. And you know, you wouldn't expect it to be that much, but on a hot day, the book is going to say that you could have a corn plant that actually loses up to 4 liters of water. You know how big a 2 liter is? That's 2 of those 2 liters. But fortunately, a plant kind of can regulate itself. It can close its stomata if it sees that too much water is going out. So that's kind of a way it self-regulates itself. Hey, I hope you've learned a little bit from Senior Mitchell about how seeds become plants.